Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Goldster Inside Story. I'm absolutely thrilled today to have with me Shrabani Basu, who is the author of many books, including this one, Victoria and Abdul, which, as you can tell, has the lovely Judi Dench on the cover because she was in the film, which we're also going to talk about. Very exciting. Welcome, Shrabani, back to Goldster for a return trip.
Absolutely. Great to be here, Lucinda, and great to be chatting with you again.
And you, because it's been such a long time with the pandemic and everything since I've actually seen you in person. But it's been wonderful watching what's been happening with your books. And I really want to talk to you about Victoria and Abdul because I feel it's extremely current at the moment with the world that we're living in. We've just had, the death of a queen and the coronation of a king. And you've been dealing with all that historically. So tell us, first of all, who was Abdul Karim?
Right. So Abdul Karim was a clerk in Agra jail. So he just kept the ledgers. He was 26 years old. Sorry, he was 24 years old. Made him a little older there. And he was sent as a jubilee present for the Queen. So he was there along with another servant, and they were just sent there because the superintendent of the jail in Agra thought, well, I've got to send her a special present. It's her golden jubilee. And what better than two Indian servants? And, when you're the Queen, you receive presents like that. So they came gift wrapped, fabulous clothes, turbans, and, all the livery. And there they were presented to her. And their job was just to stand behind her at table, look grand, in a sort of way, represent empire.
And do we know what his feelings, or the two of them, he and Mohammed's feelings were about being sent over like a parcel? Were they excited? Was it an honor? What was that feeling for them like?
Yeah, I think they were quite amazed by it. And I think there was some of it was lost in translation. And Abdul Karim thought he'd be an equerry and he'd have a horse. And instead he was just standing behind waiting at table. But I mean, just the experience for them, traveling the seas, reaching there, being presented before the Queen. They'd seen her, every office had the photograph of the Queen, and here she was, and they're, face to face. So it was amazing for them as an experience.
And do we have any recollections of his first impressions of life in Britain?
We do, because he writes his journey. So, I discovered his journals later, and in that he gives a graphic description of the journey, the first meeting with the Queen, obviously, where he presents this golden mohur to her. And not just his impressions, we have the Queen's impressions, because she writes in her diary. And this is really exciting because the first time they meet, they've been obviously told, you're not to look directly at the Queen, and you have to approach her. So he's been trained, and they go, and she writes in her journals that Indian servants, she went to Frogmore House for breakfast, from Windsor Castle. She drives to Frogmore House to have her breakfast. And she's very tired because all the Jubilee celebrations have sort of, knocked the wind out of her. And she says she's very tired, but the minute she goes there, this room is lit up by these two men in all their livery. They walk up to her, and she writes in her journal, they kissed my feet. And, we can say that Abdul Karim, he kissed her feet, but of course he looked at her. Their eyes met because he'd been told not to do. What do you do when you're told don't look? You look. And then she writes in her journals that she describes both of them. And she describes Muhammad Baksh, who's the other one, as short and smiling. And he's dismissed with just that. And Abdul is described as tall, with a fine, fair countenance. And very quickly, we have more and more entries in her journals about Abdul.
And we know from many journal entries of lots of people that Queen Victoria did admire a fine-looking man. She was a great admirer of male beauty, wasn't she?
She was. She liked a strong man, 6 feet tall. We know he was 6 feet. We know he had a gentle voice. And here is this man dressed, a young man who's actually very informal. He's crossed that barrier. He treats her like a human being. And it's not that precious. He's very inquisitive. He chats with her. He's a talkative, chatty, inquisitive young Indian. It helps that he's good looking, but he just lifts her mood. And very quickly, she says she organizes extra English lessons for him. And not just that, the Queen wants to learn Hindustani. And who does she want to learn it from? It's Abdul. So they're going to be locked away having Hindustani lessons while poor Baksh waits outside doing both the duties.
He definitely didn't have such a good time of it, did he?
No, sadly, no.
So how did you first come across the name Abdul Karim and decide that you wanted to write this story?
It's really quite amusing, Lucinda, and you'll never believe it. All good things start with a curry. So it started with food, actually. I was researching the history of how curry arrived in Britain. So I was looking at it back in the 19th century. And the one thing I knew was that Queen Victoria loved her curries and that she had 2 Indian servants who made them for her. So that was all I knew when I went to on a visit to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, which was her holiday home. And there she had this Indian corridor. And that really hit me because I had no idea that Queen Victoria was so passionate about India that she'd recreated a mini India in Osborne House. And there in this corridor was a portrait of Abdul Karim. And well, the photo is in the book. He's dressed in red with this gold turban. And holding a book, he did not look like a cook.
No, not at all. That's a wonderful portrait.
He was painted to look like a nobleman.
Yeah.
And then I moved down the corridor and there's another one. He's staring straight at me, another beautiful portrait. And then there were photographs and busts, 2 busts of him. And the final clincher was when I went to her bedroom, because she died in Osborne House and it is left exactly as it was when she died.
Yeah.
So above her bed is a photograph of Albert, Prince Albert, love of her life. But there is an adjoining area, which is the dressing room. And all visitors, I would recommend go see this. So because it's right there. And these are the clues. So next to her dressing table, there are photographs. So top photograph is John Brown, the Scottish gillie who she was really close to. He's got the top slot. And just below him is Abdul Karim. And there he was staring back at me. And I said, okay, I've got to know more about this guy. And really, that's how it started.
And so you got a proposal ready and you wrote the book.
Mm-hmm.
And when you first wrote the book, you knew that there was more to come, didn't you? Tell us about that journey of what you were hoping for with the first edition.
Right. So basically, it took me 4 years to even research the first edition, because the first thing I learned as soon as I started work on him was that all the letters written by Queen Victoria to Abdul had been burnt. So for a biographer, it's not a great start.
Yeah.
Big source material gone. So anyway, but I started and I wanted to see those Hindustani journals. I knew she'd learned some Urdu, so I was exploring that. I asked to Windsor Archives, that's where I worked. I saw her journals, the Hindustani journals, and this was a private, they'd never been opened before. No biographer had touched these. And the blotting paper fell out. They hadn't been opened for 100 years. You get those goosebumps. So I did all that. I had the book ready, but I felt I was missing. There was his voice in the journals because he's teaching her, but I was missing more. I wanted more. And then I thought, I can't do this. I couldn't find his descendants because he had no children. And I knew that after partition, I found his grave in Agra, I found his house, but I couldn't find the family. And then I said, I'm going to bring out the hardback and somebody's going to come up and I'm going to talk about him. I've been talking endlessly about him at every festival and said, I want to find the descendants. And within 2 weeks of the release of the hardback, I was in Jaipur. And then I was on a book tour in India and I went to Bangalore, and the British Council called me and said, there's a man here. And he says he's he's Abdul Karim's grandson. And I was like, oh yeah, and I'm Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
I really, for 5 minutes, I just laughed. Then he said, no, he's really earnest. He wants to meet you. I said, okay, tell him to come along. And this man came with a briefcase full of photographs. And not just that, anyone can have photographs. As a journalist, I had to vet him. And then he said, my mother is alive. And the mother was the daughter of his nephew. Abdul Karim's nephew. So it was a direct connection. And the nephew had traveled. I knew about the nephew. He traveled to England. So I have photos of Abdul Karim and the nephew, and the Queen was very fond of the nephew. And this is the nephew's daughter. So immediately went to his house, met her. She spoke in Queen's English. It was amazing. And she was very traditional Muslim, old lady. And then they said that there's a diary of his in Pakistan, in Karachi, with their cousins. And that was like, I got back to London, got my visa for Pakistan, and I was on the next flight. And the family, opened this trunk. They had never read it. 100 years locked
Gosh,
away.
never bothered to read it.
They never read it. It was just there. And then they opened it and they gave it to me. And my God.
Were they excited, or were they just bemused by your excitement?
They were excited a little bit. They were apprehensive. They were excited. They didn't know how precious this was.
No.
And then, of course, for me, it was just wonderful because this was his voice. And right from the beginning, the opening pages, he writes about the Queen. There's a photo of the Queen. And well, I had the whole story.
I find that unless you're a historian yourself, you can't understand that great excitement that people like you and I have when we touch something really old, or that something perhaps hasn't been looked at for ages. And I've had people just look at me with bemusement as if like, really? This is so interesting to you, but it's just how wonderful. You'd spent 4 years researching him already, and here was the missing piece that you'd been so desperate to find.
Absolutely. I think history is a living thing, isn't it? And that's what makes it so exciting. So I revised it. We had the paperback edition, which was due the next year. Revised it. And there it was. So we had the complete story. And then the film followed. So,
I really want to get onto the film later, actually. But I want to talk a little bit about Abdul himself. Now, when you were writing about him, what were your feelings about him? Did you like him? Did you find him frustrating? How did you feel you'd have liked him if you'd met him?
All of these, actually. When I set out, I'd read a few biographies of Queen Victoria where he's mentioned very unfavorably. He's portrayed as this character who is manipulating the Queen. He's not a nice guy, which when I'm starting my research, I was fine with. I just wanted to know what he'd done. If he'd manipulated her, well and good. So I had a completely open mind. And then when I read his journals, when I read the Hindustani journals, and more importantly, when I read what the others, the households, were saying about him, then I realized that, obviously this whole negative feeling has come because the household and her family hated him. And it's obviously so racist. I mean, it just stares at you in the face. They call him the Black Brigade. The ladies in waiting say he's repulsive. They shudder every time he walks past them. I mean, you can just see the hate, the jealousy coming out. And one of the major sources of my book was the doctor's journals, so Queen Victoria's journals, doctor's journals.
Yeah.
And he was Scottish, Sir James Reed. I went to the family house and I read his diaries. And they were so revealing as to everything is about, he was called the Munshi because he became her teacher. He was quickly promoted and was not a servant anymore. Everything is about the Munshi, all the controversy. And, he describes it as Munshi mania. And then one of the years, the Diamond Jubilee year, is described as the year of the Munshi, because behind closed doors, there is so much going on. And that revealed, the other side of the story. And
there was a huge amount of resentment. I think there's a lot of jealousy from Dr. Reed as well, that he felt, the Munshi was getting so much more preferment than him. So you've got that huge bias from all of them, haven't you?
All of them. And they are, to use the word, they're really bitchy. The exchanges are just awful. They're like sarcastic. Because he used to have these lessons, she would never miss her Hindustani lesson. So we know that one day Abdul fell ill. But the Queen wasn't going to miss her lesson. So she packed her boxes and she went to his cottage and she sat there, mopped his brow, propped him up, had her lesson. And how do we know about this? It's because these people are saying, this is not behavior suitable for a queen. She went to Abdul's cottage. I mean, horror of horrors.
Exactly how they felt with John Brown, isn't it?
John Brown.
He just took over that role.
Exactly.
Who was, for those of you who might have seen the film Mrs. Brown, John Brown was nothing like the lovely Billy Connolly figure. He wasn't a pleasant human being, but she had this absolute adoration of him, didn't she? And I think, do you think she needed somewhere to put that because she'd lost Albert, she'd lost John Brown?
Yes, absolutely. Because she was so close. After Albert, she came out of mourning thanks to John Brown. She
Yeah.
became very close to him. They were also the same age. And they became real companions. Again, John Brown crossed that border, treated her like a human being. And she loved that. He was there to protect her. Queen Victoria liked liked a strong man standing next to her, protecting her. And then
Yes.
John Brown dies, 1884, he dies. And she writes in her journal that she's devastated. She can't stand, she can't sit. And these years, just pass by, and she's again in mourning. And then 3 years later, 1887, Golden Jubilee, along comes this new person. And he takes her on this, wonderful journey, because suddenly he's from India. He's brought the real India comes to her in the form of Abdul Karim. She's never traveled to India. And he's here now telling her the real stories, describing the Taj Mahal. He's from Agra, the most romantic, monument in the world. And she loves it. Queen Victoria loved a romantic story. Here's a king who's built a mausoleum for his dead wife. She's built a mausoleum in Frogmore for her dead husband. That's marble. This is marble. Everything. She goes into this Mughal wonderland, cooks her a curry. She's eating this food. She writes, it's wonderful. She says that a curry is to be cooked in the royal kitchens every day. I was amazed about this, because
I was as well.
who even knew? And there are the menus, because, every day at lunchtime, a curry would be served. And an authentic curry. It wasn't out of a jar. It wasn't powders. It was these Indians who were pounding these masalas and, creating this.
I was wondering, because they came over with spices. How did they get replacements? I mean, was there special post being sent over from India for the Queen's curry? How did it?
I think so. I think there was once she had Abdul promoted, she needed more Indian servants. So more Indian servants, all from Agra, arrived, and they all carried spices. So, and there was constant traffic, isn't there? I mean, there was the one thing Queen Victoria wanted to eat, and this is a story I love, was a mango. And she never got to eat a mango, because in the 6 weeks that it would be sent to her, it would just go off. It didn't travel. And the poor lady never ate a mango. And now we here we eat the mangoes before they eat them. We eat the Alphonsus before they eat them in Bombay. They're exported here. So yeah, there was a lot of, so many stories, so much happening in her life, learning a new language, a new friend. I feel that it gave her a new lease of life. She lived to see another jubilee, lived another few years. And she may not have if she didn't have this new excitement in her life.
But unlike with John Brown, who she seems to have been possibly in love with, and there are rumours, of course, that they underwent a form of marriage ceremony. But it felt to me, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that she did not fall in love with Abdul Karim, but she said to him that she viewed him as her son. What
So
made
her
me so sad?
letters,
So about that was, having written my biography of Princess Louise, was how horrible she was to most of her real children. And there she is with these gorgeous maternal feelings towards him. So I could understand why her children were so angry, because she'd been so mean to them.
Especially Bertie. She's always really mean to Bertie. I mean, Bertie does a lot to make her cross with him. He's doing everything wrong, womanizing everything that she dislikes. But you do feel for him sometimes, because he hates Abdul Karim. And sometimes you can see that, he's the son, but here she is favoring this man. And it's not just any man, it's a commoner. So there's two things happening here. They hate him so there's race and class. So it's not just that, he's an Indian, but also that he's such a commoner. He's just a clerk from Agra jail, and they try to bring him down. But I mean, there's her relation with her children is really troubled. And here's Abdul. But she writes, I think the relationship is in several layers, because she sees two servants. I mean, she's presented with two. One, short and smiling, out of the window. Doesn't matter. It's the handsome one that she likes. So there's clearly a physical draw. She likes this 6-foot handsome man standing next to her, charming her. He must have been very charming. And also, at certain times, she does write, she's your mother. She signs the letters to him. Sometimes it's your friend. And sometimes she just says VRI and puts little crosses for kisses.
Right.
This is the Queen. And these are really personal, very personal letters. A few that survive are there in Windsor Castle. And well, my jaw dropped when I saw those letters as well, because, they just reveal such a close, intimate relationship, which is working on many levels. Her closest friend, a son. And it's something Victoria actually believes in, because when Albert dies, she writes that I've lost my partner, I've lost my father, and I've lost my mother. So, relationships work at so many different levels. So I think with Abdul, it was something like that.
So tell us about Abdul and the Kohinoor.
So the Kohinoor is already with Victoria when Abdul arrives. And she wears it with pride, of course. She wears it as a brooch. So it used to be, she got it when, 1849. So it's already been in the court for a while.
Yes.
It was sort of taken at gunpoint from this young Maharaja, 10-year-old Maharaja Dalip Singh. Treaty of Lahore was signed. The Punjab Treasury was annexed along with the Kohinoor. Now, Dalip Singh used to wear it as an armband, but Victoria had the diamond cut, reduced in size, and then she wore it as a brooch so that it sparkled, because in its original form, it was a large chunk of rock, but it didn't sparkle because it was rose cut Indian style.
Right.
So she wanted it European style. So lots of chiseling. Hammer went to the Kohinoor. It actually became from a large chicken egg to a quail's egg, and she wore it as a brooch. And she writes in her journal that it is there. So Abdul, we don't know what he would have personally thought about seeing it there, because it is something that was very personal to all Indians.
Yes, exactly.
And he knows that it was in Agra. It used to be in Agra, with the Mughals. It was on Shah Jahan's peacock throne. And so he's very familiar with what used to be and the history of the Kohinoor. We don't know his secret thoughts on seeing that.
He didn't ever leave any thoughts about it.
No.
Okay.
Kept that to himself. Because possibly he wanted his journals published and he didn't want too much negative thought in there.
That's what he expected, was it? That his journals would be published as a great work and they would be a kind of historic document?
Yes, he did.
Not that
because
they hid it away.
Yeah, again, we know this thanks to Sir James Reed, because he writes a letter saying, I hear Abdul Karim is writing his memoirs and he wants them published, and we must make sure they are never published.
I was wondering, because you mentioned going to Windsor. As you know, it was very hard. Princess Louise's files are closed in the Royal Archives, so I was not able to see her files. Did you not have the same experiences with Abdul Karim? It sounds like they were much more open about him. Do you think that's because most papers had already been burnt, so what you could see was fairly innocuous?
I don't know. I mean, I'm just lucky, I guess, because I was perfectly frank, and I said, this is what I want to do. I want to explore this. So there was no, I wasn't hiding anything. Yeah. And I said, I want to see Queen Victoria's journals. I want to see any entries related to that. And I want to see the Hindustani journals. And these were lessons that she would have with Abdul Karim. So there was a line in Urdu, a line in English, then it's written in Roman so she could say it out loud. And it's, I expected a little handbook, of some phrases that the Queen would have learned. And the archivist wheeled in the trolley, and there were 13 volumes there, one for every year. So I spent a lot of time there. And then they had, because no one had ever studied this, there were pages in Urdu, because he does his teacher assessment at the end of the year, which is 4 pages of him writing in Urdu. And I can't read the script myself. So I said, I've got to get these translated. We don't know what this man has written. I mean, there might be anarchy there. He might be saying, bring down the house. Who knows? I mean, I'm sure he wasn't, but I said, I have to get them translated. So they actually were really cooperative. I said, I'll give you a copy for your records, so that you have it on file, because you don't know what he said, and you should know. So so they gave me copies, and they were helpful. I couldn't have done this without these without the Hindustani journals, and they're actually really proud of it. So it goes to exhibitions now on proud display, with many of the phrases open to phrases that I have used in my book, which is very nice for me to see.
So just to clarify, because you say the Hindustani journals, and then you talk about Urdu, do you want to explain a little bit about the language?
Yeah, sure. So, they call it Hindustani, but it was Urdu, basically, which was the court language. And Abdul Karim teaches her the court language, and it has a different script. So it's not written from, left to right, but right to left. So hats off to the Queen. In her 70s, she masters a new language. She, as I said before, she never missed a lesson. So by the end of these 13 journals, she is actually writing half a page of Urdu. And it's not just, she's not just copying it. These are her thoughts. And by then it's 1901, and she's talking about the Boer War, death of family, and all this in Urdu, which, it's pretty amazing.
But I think there's often a misconception, isn't there? Because they're talked about as her Hindustani journals, but people don't realize it's actually Urdu that she learned.
It's not Hindi. Hindi is a different script, which is what you hear in India when you travel. You hear a lot of Hindi, but Urdu sounds and the words and phrases are the same. So if you understand Hindi, you'll understand Urdu, which is what I understand Hindi, obviously, and I can follow the Urdu, but I can't read the script because it's a different script.
Right. That's good, because I think people always say that he taught her Hindi, but actually that wasn't the case. They called it Hindustani. And he often gets referred to as the Hindu, even though he was Muslim. I want to talk a little bit about that language as well.
Well, it's like the generic term for all Indians was the Hindu, spelled D-O-O-S. It was always the Hindus. But of course, they were Muslim, and all her servants were Muslim, because those days, the Hindus didn't like crossing the seas. They were considered the black waters. You had to be purified if you crossed the seas. Very few Hindu travelers, but it was always the Muslims. So the Muslims were chosen. They are the ones who went. Many Maharajas did come, and they are Hindus. And they'd probably have purification ceremonies after they went back. They would bring their goats, so they would have their milk and their water. And, they carried their whole entourage with them. But the Muslims were the ones who were in her court, which again is amazing, that at the heart of the Victorian court was a young Indian Muslim. And she said his position is the same as the household. Now, the household are all, the aristocrats, the ladies in waiting. Exactly. And he's given houses, he's given his carriage, he has his own staff. And she says he's on par with the household. He can use the billiards room. When his father came visiting, the father is allowed to smoke a hookah, which is the pipe, the shisha pipe. And he's the only one allowed to smoke the hookah in the smoking room.
She hated smoking, didn't she? So that was a huge concession, because I know that Bertie and Louise particularly being female, would always have to hide. She would close off the smoking room when Bertie came to stay, and he'd be furious that there was nowhere to smoke. So that really was.
It was like giving all the concessions, anything that he wanted, which is what again made the household so jealous, because anything Karim, everything was given. Cottages. Dr. Reed asks for a room and says, can I have a John Brown's old room? No reply. And who's given the room? It's Abdul Karim. So he has his own carriage in the royal train. I mean, it's unbelievable what she gives him. Just about titles. He had every possible title. His chest is covered with medals given by Queen Victoria. And she even wanted to give him a knighthood, but the Prime Minister stepped in and she had to step back. Yeah. Lord Salisbury just said no, because his logic was that the Indian Maharajas had given knighthoods, and because class snobbery is very much there in the Indian society. So the Maharajas wouldn't be too happy to see a commoner with the title.
No, I wondered, because after he'd been with the Queen a little while, he went back home, and then he came back again, bringing his wife and his mother-in-law. I wondered what it was like for him when he went back that time. Do you think he was eager to return to England? Was it sad for him to return to England? How much did he miss India while he was here?
So within 3 months, so as I said, there was some lost in translation. He thought he'd be an equerry, and he didn't think he'd be in a sort of position as a servant. And so he wanted to go back. He said he was a clerk and he was not really a servant. And he's quite an arrogant man, as we discover, and he says he wants to go back. But we know that Queen Victoria pleads with him to stay. This is the Empress of India pleading for a common servant to stay, because she says, I enjoy your company and I would like to learn Hindustani from you. So she requests him and, well, pleads with him and says, if you have to go away, at least visit once a year. She's really like,
Mm. It was
pleading with him.
fascinating how much she was begging him. It was,
Yeah,
I was
yeah.
listening. I read this a few years ago, and I've just listened to it again on Audible, and I was thinking, wow, she really did lay it on thick about needing
Yeah.
him to stay.
Yeah, and he's 24 years old. This is the Queen of England saying, stay, I want you to stay, I enjoy your company. What's he going to do? He stays. But he's allowed to visit home. So he has his sort of annual leave. He goes home, or biannual leave. He spends a good 2 months, 3 months there. She makes sure that the Viceroy meets him. She's writing letters and letters to the Viceroy saying Abdul is there. Has to be given land in Agra. Abdul's father has to be given the equivalent of a knighthood. And you have to meet them. These are orders to the Viceroy to meet this alleged, an absolute commoner, really. So, yeah, he is rising in society, even in India. And well.
And do we know how his wife felt? Because when she came here, this must have been such a strange experience for her. Obviously, she was freezing when she went to Balmoral. What do you think it was like for her and her mother?
So the really sad thing is that he writes in his memoirs that I won't talk too much about my wife because she is writing her own memoirs.
They didn't
And
survive.
those memoirs are lost, because, partition happened in India and the family split up. They left their ancestral house in Agra. Some went to Pakistan, some stayed in India. Somebody carried, I'm so grateful to whoever it was, carried Abdul's journal, but her journal was lost. And she actually died during the partition. So she lived to a ripe old age, whereas Abdul had died. Yeah. And she died on the boat to Karachi. So the descendants told me all these stories. And I said, what was she like? I mean, what are the stories you've heard? And they said, oh, she was a right old bully. And I said, oh, good for her. She was a bossy woman. So, there are just a few insights into what she was like and mother-in-law. But he brought his whole family. He was a good Indian. They all arrived on holiday. They all spent time with him. And then they all went back, yeah.
So there were a couple of controversies, weren't there? So tell us about the brooch, Queen Victoria's brooch, and the dissension that caused in the household.
So one day Queen Victoria was wearing her brooch, and then when she came back from her carriage ride, it was missing. She dropped it somewhere. So the household, ever ready to lay every blame on Abdul, said he's stolen it. Now, Abdul was many things, but he was not a thief, but anyway, so she really flies into a rage and she says no. And then it's discovered that one of his, it was found in a jeweler's shop or a pawn shop. And they said, so that's where it went. They pawned it over there. And then it was found that one of his brother-in-laws or, all the family had taken it there. So then they had to spin a story around it. And they said, he may have just picked it up, which is possible. Of course, we don't know the whole truth. I don't think she would have dropped it on the carriage. He picked it up from the ground and he should have returned it, obviously, but he took it to this jeweler or the pawn shop. It wasn't Abdul Karim, it was one of his relatives, but there we are.
The household was then up in arms because, of course, the dresser had been blamed, hadn't she?
Yeah, the dresser had been blamed. And then when they discovered it was one of his relatives, all hell. They said, he is the thief, Abdul is a thief. I mean, they tried to plant all sorts of accusations on him. They said he's a thief, he's a spy. They had him followed on his trips to India. And finally, when they couldn't nail anything on him, and Victoria would fiercely defend him. She was so angry when they accused him of being a thief. She just said, oh, it's their custom that when they find something, they give it away. So she would just spin her own stories, but anything to protect Abdul.
And that was what was apparent with that story, was absolutely anything to protect him at any cost. It was fascinating to think this kind of hold that he'd inadvertently really managed to get over her, and the way that she fell in love with people. She did it with Albert, she did it with John Brown, and then with the Munshi. This passion where to the exclusion of everybody else was, I thought, really fascinating. Tell us about Lord Elgin's Christmas card. That's such a strange story.
So Abdul always he was always punching above his weight, and he did have a large ego. He was, I mean, the way I see it is like he's 24. The Queen has begged him to stay. And of course he's going to, then she gives him land. She gives him titles. She's given him all her love. What's he going to do? It goes to his head. He's like a spoiled teenager, a rock star who suddenly made money, and there he is. It obviously went to his head. He's often, he's got his nose in the air because he was the same rank as all the other Indian servants. But, suddenly he is their boss. So he has to look after all the Indian servants. There is resentment from the Indian servants too at his sudden rise to fame. So he's getting it from everybody, from the royal household, from the Indians themselves. But they are in a bubble, both Victoria and Abdul. And of course, so he feels that as a member of the household, he can write to the viceroy. And he sends him this Christmas card. And it's a really cheesy Christmas card with, a little poem about whatever. And the viceroy is really offended by it. How dare this commoner write? He sent me this sort of Christmas card. And he doesn't reply. And Queen Victoria is always, out to defend Abdul. So she keeps writing to the viceroy. Lord Elgin hasn't replied. Why hasn't Lord Elgin replied? She sort of writes to her personal assistant, please find out why Lord Elgin hasn't replied. So all these inquiries, it's just a Christmas card. And
it's extraordinary. And I couldn't understand why Elgin was so offended. You think it was purely because of the class system?
Oh, yes, just snobbery, pure snobbery. Yeah. How can this man approach me and send me this card? So it was pure snobbery. And now that hotly contested card lies in the British Library in the files where, the Queen's letters to the Viceroy lie. So it's really very amusing to see. It's very ordinary card with a cheesy message. It's something like, this cards you buy in shops with the roses are red kind of cards. And yeah, he sends it to the Viceroy. I was
interested because Queen Victoria becomes, as you said, fascinated by India. She had, parts of her home turned into kind of Indian area. And she at one point says, oh, it's so quick to visit there now. And the journey's getting quicker all the time. Mm-hmm. I'm surprised she didn't ever go. Why do you think she didn't ever visit India?
Yeah, well, I think that in her early years, she did visit because there was too much rebellion. There's the mutiny. There's so much going on. They didn't need her there. After that, it was a long journey and she's old. And there have been several assassination attempts on her. I think she had as many as like 11. Some were not real assassins. They were just lunatics. But whatever it was, people would get up there and take a gun and, fire at her. Yeah. So fire in her direction rather. And she was actually slightly hurt once when she dived in her carriage. But the point is, they felt it was a danger. It was too long a journey when she's old. So for various reasons, she never visited India. And she would say, I long to go to India. I would give anything. When her grandson writes about the Taj Mahal and he's visiting, she writes back that I would give anything to see the Taj Mahal.
So that was what really came across, how desperately she really wanted to go. And I was fascinated as to why you thought she didn't go. I just wondered, how was Abdul Karim viewed in India at the time when he was living here? Were people very aware of him? Was he seen to be a bit of an upstart? Was he admired? What was it like?
I think in Agra he was known. He wasn't known around the rest of India, but people who knew, there were lots of Muslims who would travel if they traveled to Britain, they wanted to see him. He would go to the mosque. There was the walking mosque, which was a purpose-built mosque, which happened during Queen Victoria's reign. And he would go there to worship over Ramadan. And he was a Hafiz, which means he'd learned the Quran. So they would invite him actually to sort of lead the prayers sometimes. And people, Muslims from all over, would go to walking mosque to see him because he was very famous as the Queen's Munshi. So there was a lot of, some Maharajas would come and they were curious to see him. Who has the Queen's ear? Who is this man? So we know from their journals that they're curious. In Agra, of course, he was well known because, she's given him land, which was like prime land in the heart of Agra. And he builds a large house there, Karim Lodge, it's called. And his house is like a museum because everybody gives him gifts. She would take her whole family, all European royalty, to visit him in his cottage, and they would give him gifts. So there was a tea set from the Tsar. Tsar Nicholas gave him some tea set. The Shah of Iran gave him a walking stick with jewels on it. His house was just full of either things from India or presents from European royalty. And he would return the gifts. Because in his journal is this wonderful letter from Tsar Nicholas, and it says, thank you for the gift of this beautiful muslin for the Tsarina. And she will, Indian muslin,
Mm.
and she will love it. And it's just signed Nicholas. And again, you just feel, my goodness, in a few years, this man, his wife, they're all going to be killed, mercilessly. And yeah, here he was just saying, Nicholas, thank you for these beautiful gifts, and gifting Abdul as well.
And how is Abdul Karim viewed today in India and Pakistan?
Well, nobody knew about him.
Oh, really? So
When
you
I
really
started,
brought this story out there as well as here.
yeah, he was completely erased from history. So when I went to Agra, because I wanted to see his grave, I knew he was buried there.
Mm.
Nobody knew him. Are you sure this man existed? What grave? There is no record of him.
Why do you
And
think that is?
and well, he'd just been erased from history. And then it took me 4 days, and I said, we're going to comb the graveyards. Which one would it be? He was an important man. He would have had a stone, a gravestone, saying what he was. He would have had,
Yeah.
something. And so we combed the graveyards with a local journalist. We went through 4 graveyards, 4 days, and then there was an old graveyard from the Mughal days, where the descendants of sort of large Mughal families were buried. It's a really desolate, unkept graveyard. And there, he was there. There was a mausoleum. The gravekeeper said, yes, he's here, Abdul Karim, the Munshi. We called him the Munshi. And he took us to this grave. It was so dramatic. We were a little procession going to see his grave. And it wasn't just a grave. It was a mausoleum. They had this whole thing, and you knew there were precious stones in it at one time, all vandalized now.
Right.
But there was his grave with all his he wasn't going to miss his honors. He must have said, my gravestone will have every honor of mine, CIE, CVO, MVO, everything, the Munshi, who was kind, all that written on the gravestone. So it was something just to see. But it also meant that nobody knew. Not even his descendants knew where he was buried. Can you imagine? So when they met me, they said, now we know through your book that we used to be ashamed of him. We thought he was not a nice guy because of the way he was portrayed. Yeah. But you have gone into his story. You found his grave. So now they're united. They've done up the grave, and there's a plaque there.
And how is Queen Victoria viewed in India today?
Well, it's a troubled question, isn't it? I mean, mainly because of one big thing, and that is the Kohinoor.
Yeah, of course.
So I think she is identified with that. She was, in her time, Queen Victoria was actually respected. So when she was alive, people saw her as the grandmother of Europe. There were books dedicated to her. There were poems written to her. There was one side which was in, sort of rebellious mode, who didn't like her. But by and large, she was popular. They saw her as a benevolent monarch, grandmother of Europe, goddess, mother goddess, all sorts of things. And, but of course, over the years, the identity of the fact that she didn't do it, but she is identified as, the crown sort of taking over after the mutiny, the crushing of the mutiny, which was the first war of Indian independence. Then, of course, seizing of the Kohinoor by, the government of the day, but it was presented to her and she wore it with pride. So I think she is identified with the Kohinoor. And
so that's why he was lost in history. Do you think his association with her really kind of tarnished him to the point that people just stopped talking about him as India entered kind of the 20th century, perhaps?
India, his story was just not known, because once his letters were destroyed, there was nothing. There was nothing to tell the world about this man. And his story was really and truly lost, both here and in India. And over the years, there's partition, the house is lost, the descendants are scattered. There was nothing tangible left anymore of this man.
So tell us about what happened when Queen Victoria died, what she'd hoped would happen and what did happen.
So when Queen Victoria died, she was, she had a lot of sense, and she knew that he was unpopular. The household had been trying to get him down for a long time. They threatened to go on strike. This was so much drama. Bertie, her son, had said that, we're going to get you to step down on grounds of insanity. And she had fought with them on this and, given them like a 30-page memo. So there was a lot of drama that had happened over Abdul Karim, and she knew that once she had gone and he lost her protection, the vultures would descend, which happened. So within hours of her funeral, which takes place in Windsor, and she's buried in Frogmore along with Albert, within hours of that, there is a knock on the door of Frogmore Cottage, which is where Abdul lived. And it's early morning, it's February, it's cold, and standing outside was Princess Beatrice, the new queen, Queen Alexandra, and a lot of tough guards. And they had been sent by the king, that's Bertie, now Edward VII, and he had sent them so they would raid his house, Abdul's house, take every letter written by Queen Victoria and burn it. So they actually just raid his house, they raid his study, they pull out all the drawers, they make a huge bonfire. She would write to him 5 times a day. I've seen some of those notes. They just took everything. They were signed VRI. Sometimes they were signed in Urdu. And these were just taken and burnt outside his house. And not just that, he was then told, marching orders, return to India. Go back where you came from. He's treated like a common criminal. And all the Indians, all the other Indians, by now there was a coterie of Indians. They were all given their marching orders. So everyone, it was a mass deportation. They were all sent back. And Edward did not want to see another curry being cooked in these royal kitchens. He didn't want to see another turban. He had had enough of this madness. And there it was. I mean, it's so lucky that he didn't pick up these Hindustani journals and chuck them in the bonfire. We're just lucky.
Gosh, yes, very lucky. So we've got some questions that have come in. One was, what did he do when he got back to India?
So when he went back, I think it just broke his heart. A queen, his protector, who he'd been so close to, had died, but also the way he was treated. So he died. He's just in his 40s. He dies within 8 years. He's gone. And it would have just been because he was heartbroken. And the family told me that, he didn't lack wealth because they were wealthy. He did a lot for charity. He had a carriage. He would ride in that carriage every day to the Taj Mahal. And there was a statue that was put up of Queen Victoria in the gardens of the Taj Mahal. He would go and sit there. And I think he just died heartbroken, really.
So that's because somebody said, how old was Abdul, which you've said in his 40s, and what did he die of?
He was about 42.
But you think he kind of just gave up?
Yeah, I think he just, he'd written this journal, which was never published, and his letters were destroyed. That's it. His life had, in a way, his life had ended. He was being treated so badly, not acknowledged for everything that he'd done. He'd given a new lease of life to the Queen. She had lived to 81 because of Abdul. I mean, I strongly believe that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, she would have died long back. And that was probably a grudge Bertie had against him.
Yeah, absolutely. No wonder.
He's waiting for his mother to die. And there she is, swanning around with this man. So,
no wonder. He must have been absolutely livid about that. So let's go back to the Queen. Let's go to this version of the Queen. Judi Dench, what was it like having your book turned into a film, and how involved were you with the script writing process?
Oh gosh, it was amazing, because this is the first book of mine to be turned into a film. And not just that, it was a film with like A-level people, it was just the A-list. You had, the Queen, Judi Dench, you had Stephen Frears directing it. It was just amazing. So I was a consultant, which means I was quite involved right from the script stage, and even the costumes, just what did 19th century turbans look like, nose rings look like, the street scenes in Agra look like, etc. So I was researching those, which I hadn't done for the book, in the British Library for the film. But it was all a lot of fun and amazing to see how they recreated everything. So we have photographs of them in this red, the livery and the turbans and things. And yeah, everything was reproduced to the last. I mean, I carried back some of the stuff from India. I said, oh, well, I'm going back. I'll take it with me. Golden buttons, handmade buttons, the turban material, some of the, just the material which would be turned into these, these elaborate salwars for them. So yeah, it was very exciting. And Judi Dench, of course, Judi Dench. I mean, she is just amazing. I mean, she was in her 80s, early 80s at the time, and she's such a perfectionist. So
Mm.
there is a scene in which those who've seen the film will remember. She's sitting there in her bed and she's eating these eggs. And Stephen Frears always takes a lot of takes. So eat one egg, she'd eat the whole egg, and she'd eat it. She ate about 6 boiled eggs, just the whole thing. She wasn't just going to take a little bite. She can eat the whole thing. And there is just so much stories. I don't know how much time we have, but Eddie Izzard was playing Bertie. He was just keep all of us, just laughing. He's just wonderful. And when they went to film, they actually film in Osborne House. So first time that permission was granted to film in Osborne House. And Judi Dench hadn't seen the Darbar Room. And it was open to the public, so they weren't allowed. And then Eddie Izzard says, would you like to see the Darbar Room? And she said, yeah, go on, let's go. And she said, full costume. And can you imagine the visitors in the Darbar Room? Suddenly, there is Queen Victoria walking in the form of Judi Dench. And it's like there was someone like, what? The ghost is walking. Is it Judi Dench? I mean, it was amazing for them anyway. It was fun. So there was a lot of fun all along. It was a great team, and she's just wonderful. What can one say?
We've got a comment here that's come in. It said, my mum, my sister, and I love the film so much. Thank you. And a very interesting question here. You said you did not think Victoria loved Abdul in a sexual way, but at what level did Abdul love Victoria? What a great question.
Well, I think he was just respectful as the queen, but I think he would turn on his charm. There would definitely be a bit of flirting and hand-holding. I mean, I'm quite sure of it. She took him away to this widow's cottage in Balmoral Estate. It's called Glassall Shield. And she used to go there with John Brown, and the household hated it. And she said, after John Brown's death, I will never go back there. And then we know the household say, again in their witchy comments, that she's gone back to Glassall Shield and she's taken Abdul with her. So there we are. They are all alone in this place. Also the journal, they say things like, hold me tight. I mean, this is Abdul.
That was an expression that he taught her. I thought, well, that's an interesting thing in itself, that's one of the phrases that she was
phrases that she learns, and he is dictating these phrases to her. Then I will miss the Munshi very much, being dictated by the Munshi. So, it's like there was a lot there. If those letters hadn't been burnt, we'd have seen probably a lot more than they were. There was a real intimacy between them.
And we've got a question here. Is there anyone else who you'd like to research?
Oh my goodness, there are so many stories, isn't it? I mean, I love writing about unknown people. I've written about Noor Inayat Khan, who was a secret agent in the Second World War. Not much is known about her. So yeah, in my next book, I am researching someone we don't know much about, but he's associated with something pretty big. I'm not going to give it away.
Excellent. Okay, well,
he was an Indian.
We will wait for this. That sounds fascinating. Talking of India, you have been out to India already this year. In fact, you've been overseas on multiple literary festivals, haven't you? And tell us about Jaipur and what you're doing very soon in London for anybody who might be able to go along.
Right. So Jaipur Literature Festival have a pop-up at the British Library every year. So this summer they're coming there this weekend of 9th, 10th and 11th of June. I'm doing 2 moderating sessions. So one session on P.G. Wodehouse, which is going to be a lark. We have some music in it and readings and extracts and a lot of, it's just going to be fun. Let's put it that way. And I'm also doing one with women of color, writers of color. So I'm doing a session with 4 women writers, which will be fun as well.
Yeah.
And then I'm doing a book club in Highclere, which will be fun. And Downton Abbey is Highclere Castle, known as Downton Abbey, to everybody as Downton Abbey, with Lady Carnarvon. So she has a book club, and we'll be discussing my latest book, which is Mystery of the Parsi Lawyer, about Arthur Conan Doyle. And we will also we're talking Victoria and Abdul.
Now, I know that but before we did these recordings, so sadly it's not on as a podcast, you came on to Goldster and talked to us about the Mystery of the Parsi Lawyer. In 2 minutes, can you tell us very quickly about it? Because just to say, everyone, I loved this book, and if you haven't yet read it, please do. Tell us very quickly about the Mystery of the Parsi Lawyer.
Right. So the elevator pitch is that this is about Arthur Conan Doyle and the only case that he investigates personally. And it is to do with an Indian lawyer, a Parsi lawyer who lives in Birmingham and who's accused of a horrendous crime. And this lawyer writes to the Parsi lawyer, he writes to Arthur Conan Doyle saying, only you can clear my name. And Arthur Conan Doyle accepts this invitation and he takes up this challenge and he investigates the case. Where's the Hat of Sherlock Holmes? And goes about it. And it's an amazing story about, well, everything, really including racism. It starts in the Victorian period and it goes on to the Edwardian period. So it covers a lot of ground. But yeah, it is Arthur Conan Doyle rising to this challenge and investigating.
Well, it's been so lovely having you back on Goldster, and I do hope that you'll come back again in a few months' time and talk to us about another one of your books. For those of you who haven't got it yet, this is it, Victoria and Abdul. It's also available on Audible, and of course, it's a film. So it's a really, really interesting story, and it's beautifully told. So thank you so much, Shrabani.
Thank you, Lucinda, for having me here. It's wonderful to chat.
I'm just going to quickly tell everybody what is coming up on Goldster. So I am back again tomorrow. And tomorrow I'm actually interviewing. This is at the request of several Goldster members. So I hope that if you're listening, you'll be very pleased about this. I'm interviewing somebody you're never going to have heard of, Humphrey Hawksley. And he, of course, is my co-presenter on this. And he is going to be talking to me as an author because he writes thrillers. We're going to be talking about his series, Ice Islands, Man on Fire, Man on Edge, and Man on Ice, about his hero, Rake Azena, a very, very interesting hero. And I think you'll really enjoy it. Then he is back as a presenter next week. Now, on Thursday, the 8th of June, he's talking to Jane Dorner, author of The Stuff of Life. And then on Friday, he's talking to author John Hands, author of The Future of Mankind. And then I'm back again the following week. I'm actually interviewing one of my cousins the following week, Gerald Dickens, who's written a really interesting book called Dickens and Staplehurst, a biography of a rail crash, a really fascinating story. And it's great that he's told it. And then I'm back with someone I'm not related to. On Friday the 16th, I'm talking to Amanda Craig, who is the novelist. She's written many novels, but she's just got a new book out called The Three Graces. So do come along to all of those. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming today. And Shrabani, take care. Good luck with JLF this weekend in London, and good luck with what you're writing at the moment. We can't wait to hear about it.
Thank you, Lucinda. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.